Is there such a thing as a good war? According to Seth Klein, there is, especially when the enemy poses a threat to not just human life, but the world as we know it. For Klein, that enemy is anthropogenic climate change, and he says we need to rally the Canadian government and its citizens in a war on CO2 emissions. Klein, in his book, dug deep into the strategies used during the Second World War and discovered how wartime propaganda and community efforts can be repurposed today for a Green New Deal. He contends a rapid transition to a carbon neutral or even a carbon zero future is possible, and that transition will create jobs, reduce inequality, and tackle climate change. So is Klein's belief that we can come together to mobilize in a wartime fashion misguided? He says no. Just look to COVID-19. The pandemic demonstrates something powerful can happen because when we name the crisis and then respond in a wartime scale action, we create a new sense of shared purpose, a renewed unity, and that liberates a level of political action that seemed previously impossible. In other words, Klein says, we can do this. I invited Seth Klein, the author of A Good War, to join me for a conversation that matters about why it's time to mobilize the intellectual, financial, and natural resources of this country to defeat climate change.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program of the Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the following and viewers like you. Please become a patron at conversationsthatmatter.tv.
Seth Klein, welcome. You've got your book there, A Good War.
Yeah.
It's an interesting title because you're using the word war, which basically says there's an enemy and we have to defeat them. What's the enemy and why is it that we have to escalate the level of discourse to that of being on a wartime footing?
Yeah. Well, so the book is about mobilizing for the climate emergency, and it invokes this wartime frame and says we need to go on to a wartime footing. I should say I'm a very unlikely guy to have written a war story like this.
I know, because you're a pacifist.
Well, I've never called myself a pacifist, but when I was a kid, I certainly cut my political teeth in the peace movement in the 80s, and I am, in fact, the child of war resistors during Vietnam. My parents came, that's why I'm Canadian. My parents came in the late 60s pregnant with me.
And here you are writing a
and
book
now
that
I've
has the
written a
word war
story.
in it.
That's
yeah.
right. And so there's a couple of reasons. One is, and I should say too, when I originally set out to write the book, it was to tackle what do we do about this gap between what the science says we have to do on climate and what our politics seems prepared to entertain. And I was only going to have a chapter on the Second World War because I had long been intrigued by the Second World War as this example of when we very quickly retooled the whole economy. Because I found it hopeful, right? Like a lot of us wonder, can we really do this in time? And really our World War II story says, actually, yeah, we can, because we've done it twice. We had to mobilize up war production and then convert back to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. But as I delved more and more into that research, I kept seeing more and more parallels and then decided to structure the whole book around lessons from the Second World War. But the main reason I'm invoking this is because what we're doing now isn't working. We've been at this for a few decades now with different governments saying it's time to tackle climate, and all we have managed to do is basically flatline our emissions as a country. We have not bent the curve.
Okay.
And so we've run out the clock on incremental debates that have been distracting. And I'm saying we need to shift gears and adopt a wartime mindset to actually do this at the scale and speed we need to do it.
So how do we do that?
Well, this is where I found all of this inspiration in our World War story. So on the economic front, first of all, it's remarkable to me, once I started to dig in, that the speed and scope of what we did as a country and actually what we specifically did here in British Columbia. I mean, we in those 6 years, from a base of almost nothing, right? There's almost no military production in Canada before World War II. We produce about 750 ships, about 350 of them right here in our own province, where it seems we can't even build one of our own ferries anymore. 16,000 military aircraft, producing the fourth largest air force in the world. 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. So how did we do that? Well, I became quite fascinated by this guy, C.D. Howe. who was the minister in the King government who oversaw all of this. Not a lefty, by the way.
No.
You know, on the right wing of the Liberal Party, had come out of the private sector, made a lot of money. But he became really seized by this task. So he was happy to give lots of contracts to the private sector. But I describe him as an engineer in a hurry. And he was an engineer by training. And so anytime the private sector couldn't quickly do what he needed done, he created another crown corporation to do it. He created 28 crown corporations in the course of World War II across these areas to drive that change. He also, what he basically did is he started by taking an inventory. What do we need? And what have we got? What can we produce? And then he set about filling the gap, either through contracts to the private sector or new crown corporations. And then he carefully coordinated all the supply chains, all the key inputs, machine tools, rubber, silk, oil, coal, timber. All of them are being carefully coordinated to prioritize wartime production. He starts recruiting friends from the private sector, including some prominent British Columbians like Macmillan, H.R. Macmillan, Woodward. They all abandoned their private sector posts to go become dollar-a-year men for C.D. Howe, overseeing much of this. And I think that's what we need to do today. We need to take an inventory of how many solar arrays do we need, how many wind turbines, how many electric buses, how many electric heat pumps. What's the new generation crown corporations we should be establishing to expedite doing that at scale and deploying it at scale to actually decarbonize and electrify in the short window of time that we have.
Okay, so what is the biggest obstacle to being able to create that collective effort? Because when we take a look at the Second World War, we had known enemies, Germany, Japan. And so we could all agree that that was the enemy.
We could, except we didn't. Here's one of the interesting things. I, like myself included, before I set out on this little journey, I think we look back in the rearview mirror and we assume, September 39, Canada declares war, everyone's ready to rally, everyone understood the threat to be clear and present, except that's not true.
That I agree with you. It's not true.
It's not true. The country was quite divided on these things. It was not a country that was keen to go to war. It wasn't a government.
Especially in Quebec.
Especially in Quebec.
Yeah.
But King himself didn't want to do this right up until the 11th hour.
Roosevelt didn't want to go to war either.
Yeah,
he was nudging the United States too, but they didn't want to go.
Well, and we went 2 years before they did.
Yeah.
Right? It took time to move U.S. public opinion, and unlike for us, it ultimately took an attack on their soil.
Yes.
Which is an interesting point of comparison. My point is, something happened, some combination of leadership, because it took leadership, and circumstance, to ultimately get a public truly mobilized. Now, interestingly, I wrote this whole book before the pandemic, and I shipped it off for a final copy at it 3 days before the pandemic. And I thought we needed an historic reminder of how quickly we're capable of pivoting, and here we all are, right?
Well, you got it.
So I think parts of it were pretty prescient. It's kind of,
Yeah.
I wrote a new epilogue in the book for COVID, and otherwise didn't touch the body of the book.
Well, and you've noted that you're going to continue to update your blog on
I've been
that
doing
point.
that online on my website. So it's always, your question is, how does it happen? So it takes leadership finally getting it, but at least we've now all gotten a taste in this pandemic. Yes, this is what it looks and sounds and feels like when a government actually treats an emergency as an emergency. And it makes for such a stark contrast with the lackadaisical approach both our federal and provincial governments have taken on climate.
Okay, so why is it that people have embraced the emergency that is COVID-19? We're still in this tug of war between different camps around climate.
Yeah.
And until you get to that critical point, do you think that we can actually mobilize the government and then individuals to take on these tasks?
Well, we will.
That
The
you're
question
putting
is,
on?
will it come in time? I mean, the curse of the climate crisis is that relative to COVID and relative to the war, it moves in slower motion.
Yes.
And that's a challenge. In both COVID and the war, there are these instances where something clicks for the public, right? So in the war, it's the fall of France in June of 1940, right? That changes the popular zeitgeist about just how serious this is. With COVID, I don't know, maybe it was the cancellation of the NBA season. That's what I remember. Suddenly people were like, what, the NBA's canceled? This is serious. But right away, too, our governments, to their credit, have shown leadership on COVID, right? When our governments start having daily press briefings, when they invoke emergency acts as necessary, when they strike special committees of cabinet to coordinate emergency actions, when they commandeer buildings and assets as required or supply chains, they're signaling, okay, it's an emergency. Now, you contrast that with climate, where the messaging is totally confusing.
Yes,
right?
it is.
What does it mean for last summer Justin Trudeau to pass a climate emergency motion in the House of Commons one day and reapprove the Trans Mountain Pipeline the very next day? That's confusing. Or within our media landscape, what does it mean that we allow advertising by fossil fuel cars and gas stations? We don't do that for tobacco. So if you're someone in the public or a young person and you're told on the one hand, hey, this is an emergency, on the other hand, they're still advertising to you, that's confusing. That's not consistent messaging.
Well, it's muddied waters because smoking, I can look at and go, ugh, you do that, you're going to die directly, and you're going to impact me.
Yeah.
Okay, we want to take on the fossil fuel sector. You're going to take that away, and you're going to give me what? Because solar and wind aren't going to be up to the challenge of completely replacing the easy access to energy that comes through the burning of fossil fuels. And so this is where I think people start to get a little worried.
Yeah.
Well, hang on a second here. You mean I can't drive my car? I can't heat my house? I can't turn on the lights whenever I want to?
Well, people rightly have all kinds of questions, and they can't yet imagine, and I would say this is part of the failure of leadership, they can't imagine what that alternative life looks like. How do I get around? What does my house look like? How does it get heated? How do I make a living? Can I still enjoy the leisure parts of my life? These are all entirely legitimate questions that our public institutions have failed to answer, even though the answers are there. I outline them in my book. And, at the very basic level, I commissioned some original polling for my book from Abacus Research. And I found some very hopeful stuff in there. The public gets the emergency. And incidentally, I've tried to recast some of the extreme weather events we've experienced as attacks on our soil. Let's think about them that way.
Yeah.
And they're ready for bold action. Actually, the public is ahead of our politics in terms of that.
Well, I was surprised to see that you even mentioned in Alberta the numbers are much higher than you would anticipate.
So you mentioned Quebec before. So the opinion polling nationally ranges from a high in Quebec in terms of their readiness for action to a low in Alberta. But even in Alberta, the level of support is remarkably high. But, not to get too Pollyanna about this, the landscape is confusing. So the good news is the terrain has really shifted in the last couple of years. The student strikes, extreme weather events, Indigenous solidarity stuff, all of that has shifted the terrain. But at the level of basic climate literacy, only about half of Canadians can correctly identify the main source of global warming as the combustion of fossil fuels.
Namely coal for the production of electricity.
Well, yeah. I mean, not an issue in our province, but it certainly is in others.
No, but globally it is.
And globally it is. So whatever the fossil fuel is, whether it's coal or gas or oil, the public doesn't actually understand, which is an incredible indictment of the fact that our governments and the media have not done some of their basic job in terms of boosting that level of literacy. And consequently, you end up with confusing polling results where people will say, on the one hand, I'm ready for action and I support the expansion of LNG or the tar sands, because why not?
Okay, so is the answer, and I know that this is what you're suggesting in your book, that we mobilize, that the government get involved in R&D, the creation of these crown corporations that are going to put money and brain power behind developing a wide range of solutions that are going to reduce our carbon footprint? Or do we also need to take a look at what's our population footprint? Because people consume energy. The more people there are, the more energy that gets consumed.
There's a couple things in your question. So first of all, what do I want from our government?
Right.
I want to see them adopt an actual emergency wartime footing, and I think there are a few signs of when you know that that's happened. We're getting a taste of that in the pandemic.
Yes.
You adopt a wartime or emergency mindset. That helps to liberate a kind of level of collective purpose and makes new things possible. You expect to see your government spend and invest to win, right? Like we've seen in the pandemic, like we saw in the war, like we have decidedly not seen with respect to climate. You would expect them to create new economic institutions to get the job done. So that's what I mean by that new generation of crown corporations. And by the way, I still think there's a role for the private sector in all of this. But there was a huge role for the private sector in the Second World War, but what they didn't get to do was decide on the allocation of scarce resources, because you don't do that in an emergency. And I think that's the mindset we need today. You're secondarily bringing in the population question, and the population needs to level off at some point. It will level off in the next few
40
decades.
years.
But here's the thing. I'm more interested in the issue of the distribution of income, because what we know is that the wealthiest 10% globally are responsible for, by far and away, the majority of GHG emissions. Yes. And in our own country, the wealthiest 20% of Canadians have about double the emissions of the poorest 20% of Canadians.
Right.
And the higher you go up the income ladder, the greater your runaway emissions.
Yeah.
So what I'm actually saying in the book is part of the climate mobilization is also tackling inequality for two reasons, actually. One is because inequality drives increased emissions, GHG emissions, but also because that's how you win. That's how you mobilize people. That is one of the key lessons from the Second World War, is that inequality itself is toxic to social solidarity and society-wide mobilization. If you're asking people to truly rally in common cause, people need to know that everyone's in and everyone's doing their part. In the First World War, there had been rampant profiteering. It had undermined social solidarity and undermined recruitment, actually, forced conscription onto the table. Kind of like we've seen in this pandemic, where despite, we're all in this together, just a couple of weeks ago, my former colleagues at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives published a little paper that the wealthiest 20 Canadians had increased their cumulative wealth by $37 billion since the start of the pandemic.
Wow.
Now that was illegal in the Second World War. The King government brought in an excess profits tax. He brought in increases, both the individual taxes and the corporate tax rate went from 18 to 40%, because that's how you signal to the population, okay, we're all in. And on the flip side, our two first major social programs came in the war. Unemployment insurance, 1940. The family allowance in 1944. The whole architecture of the modern Canadian post-war welfare state is written in the Marsh Report during the Second World War and is offered as a promise to Canadians that not only are we asking you to rally in defense of democracy and against fascism, we're making a pledge to you that you're not going to come back to the same country you left. That, to me, is the power of something like the Green New Deal. It's not just about decarbonizing everything and electrifying everything. It's also about creating a better society that can actually, and the promise of which gets everyone on the bus.
There's no doubt that if we can develop those technologies and innovations that are going to change the way in which we produce the energy that's needed to maintain our quality of life, Canada and all of us will benefit. But if we go back to the war, we can see that, there was a price still of sacrifice that was made by the average person. Do you foresee that if we do, as you suggest in your book?
Well, it's a mix. By the way, I mean, interestingly, the kind of sharing that occurred, there was rationing and so on, and there was sacrifice in the Second World War. Interestingly, meat consumption went up in the war because lower income people under rationing could eat more meat than they did before the war.
Right.
So yes, there's sacrifice. There's also, lots of people have written about how at a kind of psychological level, people remember this period with great fondness. That
Well, because there was a collective experience.
collective experience,
Yeah.
collective meaning and purpose. So part of what I'm arguing in the book is that, yeah, this is going to be harder and more challenging than our governments are telling you. Our governments are basically telling, this is pretty easy, you can do it, you don't have to make any hard choices. And I'm trying to say, no, let's tell the truth. There are some hard choices. We can't keep doing everything the same way. But I'm also saying that when we start to paint that picture of what our neighborhoods look like when we're serious about this, what our transportation looks like, what our health looks like, that it's actually a better world. It's a good life, and in some ways, a more meaningful life than the one we'll be leaving behind.
Well, you present some really great ideas in here, and as you say, you tell the truth, which is, I applaud you. It's a good book. It's a good bit of work, and I'm sure that it was quite a bit. Thanks for coming in and sharing
Thanks,
this. Yeah.